Hi, this is Dr. Mark Hyman, Director of the Cleveland Clinic Center for Functional Medicine, and welcome to our Q&A with Dr. David Ludwig from Harvard Medical School, Children's Hospital, and one of the leading researchers in metabolism, insulin resistance, and our understanding of weight and weight regulation. He's been my hero, one of the pioneers in understanding the phenomena of the glycemic load, glycemic index, and how that affects weight. So welcome to Cleveland, Dr. David Ludwig.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So we just got to hear your grand rounds on overeating causing obesity or obesity causing overeating, which is sort of a paradigm-shifting view. The challenge is the whole calories in, calories out hypothesis, which we've all learned, which is that if you eat more and exercise less, you're going to gain weight, and if you want to lose weight, you should eat less and exercise more.
Sounds pretty simple, doesn't it?
Seems like a very straightforward
Why
math
isn't
problem.
it working?
It's not working, no. And you know,
like, why aren't we out of a job?
We should be, right? If it was so easy, right? If everybody did it. But you know, the thing that I've learned from you over the last decade and a half or more is that, and it was really from your first study looking at these children who were overweight, who were given 3 different diets of same calories. One was a high glycemic diet of oatmeal, and there was an intermediate diet of steel-cut oats, and a low glycemic diet of an omelet. And even though they were the same calories, the kids who ate the omelet ate 81% less food, were less hungry, had lower levels of insulin, glucose, and adrenaline and cortisol than the ones who had the high glycemic diet. And that just was an explosion in my mind back in the probably 1999 when you did the study. And it really started me on this path of thinking about this. And you've just taken it much, much farther. So, one of the challenges is that the prevailing paradigm is so strong. And there's a couple of studies recently I want to dig in with you about that were done by Dr. Kevin Hall from the NIH, who's a really extraordinary man, researcher who's focused on looking at mathematics analyzing metabolism. And the first study was looking at a controlled metabolic ward, looking at a very low-fat diet or a very low-carb diet, and how that affected calorie burning and metabolism. And his conclusion was that the low-fat diet did better. That was the headline. And the subsequent study is the Biggest Loser study, where he looked at the participants in the Biggest Loser study show, and he measured their metabolisms before and after the Biggest Loser, and then a year later to see what happened to them. And it seems universally they gained back the weight and even more, and then even worse, their metabolism was slower at the end of the study when they gained back the weight, which was kind of depressing, leaving everybody with the message that weight loss is hopeless, that you're going to gain back the weight, and your metabolism is damaged, and there's no way to fix that. So could you kind of dig into your thinking about that? Because I know you've written a lot about it. There's an article on Medium about your response to this. Yeah.
Well, let's start with the Biggest Loser study. So the study was published in the journal Obesity and then linked to a New York Times article that got international attention and presented a pretty bleak picture. Now, note that this is an observational study and a very limited one. In fact, they just followed a small number of Biggest Losers,
like a dozen people or so,
over a few years, and found that even the most successful of the Biggest Losers on TV struggled incessantly with hunger and experienced a slowdown in their metabolism years later. So increasing hunger, slowing metabolism, which is the body's evidence of pushing back against weight gain. Mm-hmm. Most of them regained much of their lost weight. And so on the surface of it, that's a bleak picture, that if even the Biggest Losers, extremely disciplined, a small set of the most motivated among us can't do it, what hope is there for the rest of us?
Yeah, like just give it up.
So I think that's just half the story. Now, it's an important half, which I think gets neglected in our current calorie in, calorie out mindset, which is that you can't just cut back calories and ask people to stick to that naively without considering biology, the body's responses. So if you take people who are heavy, they're overeating typically, and why? Right. Usually, for a lot of reasons to overeat, but one of the main reasons is they're hungry. They're hungry. And if you cut back calories, what happens to hunger? It goes up. So what are we supposed to do for the rest of our lives. Just ignore that and live with perpetual hunger.
So if Jillian Michaels is yelling at you all the time,
you may
then
be
you might
able to do it temporarily.
But
Or if you're living, in an extremely restrictive environment, you're a peasant on a rural village in China working 14 or 16 hours a day, there isn't much food, you're not going to get obese, but you're not going to be feeling good. And that's certainly not a good model for what happens in the United States. So, but the point that was missed in the Biggest Loser study is that, yes, the body fights back, but this body weight set point that we're fighting back against isn't set in stone.
Yeah. Well, just to pause there for a minute, when people say the body's got a set point that it goes back to, it misses the point that 150 years ago, there wasn't all these obese people walking around, and they had a different set point. So how does that set point change for humans, in just a 1 century?
Yeah, well, that's the point. That 30, 40 years ago, we were fighting to defend a set point that was 30 or 35 pounds lighter than it is today. So what's causing us to be defending this higher set point today compared to 30 years ago? And, but by implication, there are things that we can do with our diet to alter that set point. And one area that I've been exploring for most of my career is the possibility that the processed carbohydrates, not just sugar, but white bread, white rice, prepared breakfast cereals, low-fat cookies, crackers, chips,
even
all of
starchy
these foods.
Potatoes, right?
Yeah, even the white russet potato, which is not
Peruvian,
the not the little purple
potatoes, right.
Peruvian potato, but it's been hybridized to make the perfect French fry. It digests into sugar in minutes after eating. So that what they're doing is raising levels of the hormone insulin too fast and too high. I call insulin the miracle grow for your fat cells, just not the sort of miracle you want happening in your body.
No.
We know this. This is endocrinology 101. If you give somebody too much insulin and someone with diabetes too much insulin, they predictably gain weight. A child with type 1 diabetes who can't make enough insulin will predictably lose weight until coming to treatment, getting adequate.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. You can eat 10,000 calories a day as a type 1 diabetic before you get on insulin and you lose weight. So insulin is what's driving most of the accumulation of fat.
Well, it's a key player. And if you don't have diabetes and you're not getting insulin injected, the fastest way to change the amount of insulin in your body is the amount and type of carbohydrates you eat. But other aspects of the diet beyond carbohydrate also affect that. But it leads to the possibility that our primary approach to obesity treatment the last 40 years, the low-fat diet that has endorsed all manner of processed carbohydrates, beyond just fruits and vegetables, which many of us are accepting are healthy, but all of these. But that's not the debate. You can eat lots of fruits and vegetables and a lot of fat, but if you start decreasing your fat intake, it becomes very hard not to be increasing the processed carbs. And that campaign that was launched 40 years ago, the low-fat diet, as embodied by the first food guide pyramid of 1992, may have, unhappily contributed, not prevented, the obesity epidemic.
But there are those who say, well, we've reduced our total fat from 40 to 30% of calories, but we've increased our total calories and increased our total consumption of food. And so what do you say to the naysayers who are focusing on that we haven't actually been eating low fat enough, that we should be eating more like 10 or 20% fat?
It's true that we decreased fat as a proportion, as we were told. And as that happened, the calories in our diet, our total calorie consumption went up. But these aren't true, and unrelated. They're true, and related. In other words, why are we eating more? Well, it may be that as you substitute processed carbohydrates for fat, you trigger biological changes that are driving fat storage, leading us to be hungrier and gaining weight. And and there's not a shred of evidence that a continued focus on fat reduction. So it was, 40 years ago, they were just saying, well, get fat below, get it to around 30%, and we'll be fine. So now that we're at about 30%, the argument is, oh, well, we really should have gone lower, 20%, 10%. There's just no precedent. There's no evidence for that. And it may be that some people could do perfectly well on a 20% fat diet. I'm not arguing that everybody should be eating high fat, but there's no evidence on a population basis that a continued focus on fat reduction is helpful. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that it is hurtful. The highest nutrition quality foods today, the top of the list for protection against diabetes, heart disease, maybe even neurodegenerative diseases, are among the highest fat, most calorie-dense foods in existence.
Which just sort of blows up the whole idea that we should be eating low fat because it has less calories.
Yeah.
And that now you're saying your Always Hungry program starts out at 50% fat, which seems like total heresy in the nutrition community.
Not heresy anymore. I mean, there's enough people who are, recognizing that, the low-fat diet was sort of a 40-year folly. But unfortunately, the consequences, the nutritional establishment has not really embraced the fact that this was a public health mistake.
No.
And the bar keeps shifting a bit. Well, let's get fat down to 30% and we'll automatically lose weight. And then when these diets of higher fat diets came out showing more weight loss, initially the response was, all right, maybe you can lose more weight on a high-fat diet, but you'll be a good-looking corpse.
Right. You can lose weight with chemotherapy, but that doesn't make it good, right?
You'll die of heart disease. And then when it turns out, like when the Predamid study came out, that they had to stop early because heart disease rates dropped so fast in the high-fat groups. Now the argument was, oh, well, maybe a high-fat diet is okay, but a low-fat diet would be even better if you got it down to 15 or 10%. But
right.
The bar keeps moving.
Well, what your arguments are...
And the key point here is that public health, the public remains focused on fat reduction because there hasn't been a clear recognition of its failures, and public health policy remains mired in the low-fat paradigm. Today, as a child, a 10-year-old kid can go to school and get fat-free milk loaded with sugar.
Yeah.
It's called chocolate milk.
Yeah.
But he's prevented by regulation from getting unsweetened, plain whole milk.
Yeah.
So this is ridiculous, and it is an evidence of the fact that we haven't really done a proper accounting of the biggest public health experiment ever conducted.
Well, David,
the low-fat diet.
We
have to learn these lessons. Let's learn these lessons and move forward. Let's not try to obscure what had happened by shifting the goalposts.
Well, it's so extraordinary about your work is it sort of answers that in quite a rigorous way by looking at the biology of obesity in ways that many others haven't. And some of the most compelling things you talked about in your recent grand rounds here was that when you looked at, for example, animal studies and even human studies, when you kept calories the same, you saw profound shifts in metabolism. You saw in the very low fat group, they actually burned far less calories, about 300 less calories a day than a high fat group of 60% fat, even on an isocaloric diet. And the other study that was sort of fascinating was an animal study, which has limitations, but when you restricted the carbohydrates, the animals started to lose weight. So you had to increase their calories. And despite the increase in calories, the group that had the low fat diet actually lost muscle, and they gained more fat even though they ate less calories, which is kind of stunning. And not only that, what you found was that the phenomena that triggered all this was that insulin went up first before they started overeating. It was preceding everything. So that's really profound, and that actually explains the biology of why our metabolism slows down on a low-fat diet, why it speeds up on a high-fat diet, and what happens to our muscle mass. So it's this whole cascade of biology. It's not just a sort of an abstract theory around weight. This is something you've really dug into.
So maybe we can pick up first with the question that you asked earlier about whole stuff.
Yeah, because that's right. Explain that.
Then we can, because that was looking at a low-fat diet, and it was interpreted. He actually did two studies. I'm not speaking of the observational Biggest Loser study that we already
Yeah.
talked about. He did two
Metabolic ward studies.
metabolic ward studies. One was a 6-day study. So the arms were of 6 days, a low fat or a high fat.
Very long trial.
6 days.
Yeah, that was long. Yeah.
6 days. And the other was a non-randomized, it got a lot of attention. He did a YouTube video, but it actually hasn't been published yet as of this point. And that was a non-randomized study, a month at a time on a low fat, on a sort of a standard American diet or a very high fat ketogenic diet. Both of these studies have, they're fine studies, but they have major limitations which completely preclude testing the hypotheses we're discussing.
So it was the wrong study designed to answer the question.
Well, let me just comment. So first of all, you take an American public that's insulin resistant, eating a high carbohydrate diet, and you put them on a low carbohydrate, high fat diet, it's going to take a while to metabolically adapt to that. Now, I think Hall tends to dismiss that, but there's clear evidence for that effect in the literature and in his very own studies. In the 1-month study that he did, first of all, it was non-randomized, and it was biased to favor the standard American diet. It came first. And remember, people were put in a metabolic ward for a month and then a second month. So we know that when you're in a ward, first of all, you're not moving around as much, you're not working out and such. Your lean mass is going to slowly deteriorate.
Sure.
They also didn't get the calories right, so their weight progressively declined. So you start that high-fat diet in a much worse metabolic state.
So your lower metabolism and
you got lower weight, probably less muscle, and despite that, they still had a faster metabolic rate, 150 calories a day. Now, Hall argued that wasn't big enough. We really should have seen more. But
just ignore the man behind the curtain kind of thing?
Well, first of all, 150 calories by his own calculations.
Yeah.
150 calorie gap, an energy gap, is the whole obesity epidemic.
It's a lot.
He published this, and he was correct about that in Lancet. So why that would be dismissed that way. But that 150 calories could have been 300 or 400 calories if you take into account the weight loss effects, the losing.
So he set it up to fail, but it still succeeded.
Well, no, I'm not saying there was any poor intention in the design, but it was by design a pilot study.
Yeah.
And so a pilot study is used to inform a definitive study. You can't take a pilot study and dismiss a hypothesis like the insulin carbohydrate hypothesis, but actually a fair interpretation of it, as I wrote on my Medium platform, is that it's actually strong support. Now, the last thing I want to say is if you look at fat oxidation.
And I'd encourage anybody who wants to understand this more, go read David's article on Medium about his response.
David Ludwig, MD, on medium.com.
Yeah. It's a blog platform.
Yeah, and you can follow me, David Ludwig, MD, on Twitter or Facebook.
And buy his book.
What's the name of the book?
Always Hungry.
Okay.
Why would you buy a book that makes you always hungry, though? I don't understand that.
Well, that's the subtitle. Conquer cravings, retrain your fat cells, and lose weight. But, if you look at the poster that Hall presented, you can see what's happening to fat oxidation on both of the diets. Now, you start losing you start losing body fat with the calorie restriction that he inadvertently had on the standard American diet. When he shifted to the ketogenic high-fat diet, yes, fat oxidation temporarily slowed down because the body isn't used to burning fat. It takes a while to adapt, and that decreased. But if you look at the second 2 weeks, you can see that there's an acceleration.
Yeah.
So if you
it takes about 2 or 3 weeks to adapt, right?
Well, it might, for some people, it might take a few months.
Yeah.
So the key is what's going to happen after 2, 3, 4 months. We're in the midst of a big clinical trial of 150 people, each studied for a full academic year. So we hope to have...
And this is like a $12 million study, right?
Yes.
Where you're looking at trying to definitively answer this question, is a calorie a calorie?
Yeah.
Right.
We hope to have results in about a year and in late 2017. So ultimately we need definitive data. Research from my group has suggested that after a month on a high fat diet, using stable isotopes to look at total energy expenditure, you can see a significant metabolic advantage to a high fat diet. What we saw was about 325 calories a day. Now, I'm not proposing that that's the final answer, definitive. It doesn't, prove anything, but it provides a strong basis for thinking that the type of calories you eat could affect the number of calories you burn in ways that have everything to do with the prospects of long-term successful weight loss management. Now,
this is called the insulin carbohydrate theory, or the hormonal hypothesis.
Yeah, or the fat cell
as opposed
theory
to
of
the
obesity.
energy.
This
hypothesis.
way of thinking is that overeating is a consequence, not the cause of obesity. So that, and how do you, a simple experiment, you could do this yourself, or you could look at the literature. It's been done dozens of times. Take people at whatever their usual weight is. Lean for a guy like you, or in the obese category for someone else. And then force feed them. You do this voluntarily, you pay them, and people volunteer for this sort of thing.
Eat a lot.
You force feed them, and people think this is going to be a great study because they talk about all these delicious foods. And, for the first day or two, people might be enjoying themselves, but they start gaining weight, and their body starts to push back, and they start feeling miserable. They don't want to be eating 1,000 calories too much. They lose all interest in food. Their metabolism speeds up in their body's attempt to get rid of the calories. And at the end of the force feeding study, they're delighted. They eat less, and their weight comes right back down to where you started. So yes, overeating can, in acute setting, cause some weight gain. But we're arguing that that's not what's driving the obesity epidemic. We've had cause and effect mixed up. The basic problem is our fat cells are triggered to suck in and store too many calories by the high insulin that's produced on our high-carb diet. They feast, the rest of the body starves. The brain sees that there aren't enough calories in the blood, and that's why we get hungry. The body goes into starvation mode. And if you simply
So you're
cut
basically
back,
starving even while you're obese. It seems like your body perceives that you're starving.
That's right. There's plenty of calories, too many calories in the fat cells, but that's not what the brain sees.
But initially when they eat, there's a ton of calories in the bloodstream, right? But then it kind of crashes because of the high insulin.
So if you eat the bagel, fat-free cream cheese, and orange juice, you're good for the next hour. You feel great. That's why you eat it. But it's what happens 3-4 hours later. Those calories get excessively deposited in fat cells. Your brain says, we've got a problem, Houston. Bring in reinforcements in the form of usually more processed carbs. And you overeat on them. You feel good again for the next hour or two. And then you're back where you started a few hours later. What's that? If that involved any other substance, we'd call it an addiction.
Right. So going back to the Biggest Loser study, these people had impaired metabolism at the end of the study. And is there a hope for fixing that metabolism? You see these people yo-yo diets, they go up and down. You often lose muscle and fat. When you lose weight, you gain back often mostly fat, so your metabolism is actually slower.
That's exactly what we showed, at least in a preliminary sense in the studies that you've cited. So that when somebody was weight reduced, so we weight reduced people, we fed them everything, we knew what they were eating, fed them everything that they consumed for 7 months. This was published in JAMA 2012. First author the study director was Kara Ebling, my research partner. And so we showed that this metabolic rate plummeted with weight loss on a standard high-carb, low-fat diet, but that on a low-carb, high-fat diet, metabolism didn't slow down at all with weight loss. It was like the body didn't know it had lost weight. That's going to be, that if we can change, if those Biggest Losers had that 325 calorie metabolic advantage, that would solve their problem.
So you're assuming that they might have actually been eating a low-fat diet and a continued attempt to lose weight, which is why they couldn't maintain it and then gain back the weight.
Well, what if 95% of the population who have been trying to control their weight over the last 40 years been eating?
Low-fat diets,
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly been interest in Atkins and other diets, but most people, to this very day, according to a Google poll, most people who are trying to control weight are still focused on fat reduction.
So you're saying if these...
And that's not surprising, given that we were told to do that. For 40 years, we were told, if you don't want fat on your body, don't put fat into your body.
And so that 60% fat diet that you use, that speeded up metabolism, and you think that would offset this
That's
negative
the whole story.
effect?
If that 325 calorie advantage is real, that's more than the whole obesity epidemic. No, that is the whole obesity epidemic, without postulating a change in food intake.
And of course, does it matter what kind of fat?
Just as carbohydrates. So I'm not making the argument that we should give up all carbohydrates, and there are many that are delicious, nutritious, and can be tolerated by most people. Now, if you've got the ultimate metabolic meltdown, type 2 diabetes, which is by definition carbohydrate intolerance, we may want to be thinking about even limiting things like fruit. But for most people, whole fruit looks really good, metabolically, in the studies that exist. And they differ from the processed carbohydrates. And in the same sense, we know fat differs in its metabolic effects. Trans fats, of course, are the closest thing to poison in the food supply. Happily, they're on their way out. Saturated fat, in my opinion, is not public health enemy number one, but that doesn't mean we want to bathe in butter either.
Well, it's not a health food, but it's not the enemy.
That's right. If you over-focus on getting rid of saturated fat, you get rid of a whole bunch of healthy foods, like real dark chocolate.
Well, I found stunning when I was reviewing fats that breast milk is, by calories, 25% saturated fat. It's the most abundant fat in breast milk, which makes you wonder why we were designed to feed healthy babies with all this saturated fat if it was so bad for us. And what about vegetable oils? Because I think there's been a large push, especially from a lot of colleagues at Harvard, of eating more vegetable oils or polyunsaturated fatty acids as a protective mechanism. And yet there's been this new trial that was a randomized controlled trial that was data buried for 40 years that showed saturated fat versus vegetable oil. The saturated fat actually did better. The vegetable oil, even though they lowered the LDL more, they had more heart attacks and deaths, even though it was verified by autopsy and weight
studies. So there are
studies.
2 studies that have come out by the same group of rediscovered data that weren't fully published. One involved the Sydney study and the other from Minnesota. And these are interesting studies. They provide some data. Neither of these studies are definitive. The vegetable oils that they used during this time, and remember this is the 60s and 70s, would have likely been loaded with trans fats.
Although the corn oil study, I don't think.
There was likely to have been trans fats. Now the authors make an argument where they argue that that was probably not a definitive factor there, but I don't think the effects of both total trans fats and specifically the types of trans fats can be known. Unfortunately, we just don't know.
Yeah.
And so clearly, everybody recognizes the if you increase trans fats, you're thinking you're decreasing saturated fat, but what you're really doing is increasing trans fats. We all acknowledge that's a bad idea. Yeah. The other concern about the study is that there was such an aggressive replacement of all oils with these omega-6 plant oils that they've succeeded in reducing an already low intake of omega-3.
Yeah.
And we know omega-3 is critical.
Yeah.
So if you push omega-3s artificially down by just flooding plant oils everywhere, that could be a problem too. Now, in the epidemiology, plant oils look good. People have
But they often are combining omega-3 and omega-6 in those studies so that actually you can't decipher the effect. Because if you add omega-3s, it's sort of a counterweight to excess omega-6s.
Yeah, so this is a really controversial area as to whether there is an optimal ratio of omega-6 to omega-3, which it's hard to see in the epidemiology is the case. But there's some there's theoretical arguments. Omega-6s are a little, tend to go along the inflammatory pathway. Right? There's no question that of the two, we're under-consuming omega-3s to a much greater extent than omega-6s. And as to what the optimal amount of all of these, omega-6s and 3s are required, but the approach that we take is not to banish saturated fat, although we encourage a range of unsaturated fats. We like them to be as unprocessed as possible.
Like monounsaturated olive oil,
olive oil,
avocados,
avocado,
nuts and
but
seeds.
whole nuts and seeds, and it's going to give a range of fats plus other benefits. And I think that
So get your fats from whole foods.
yeah, well, olive oil is technically not a whole food, but real olive oil, is green because it's just this slurry of antioxidants.
Right.
So,
Well, David, this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you for joining us at Cleveland Clinic
all right.
and sharing your wisdom with us. And I think what's really even more exciting is the studies yet to come that we've been talking about, the ones you're doing, and answering these questions that will hopefully flip the paradigm, not just for a few of us paying attention, but for the rest of the country and help us solve this obesity epidemic. So thank you so much
Pleasure.
for joining us.
Got it.